On December 22, 1944, around 11:30 a.m., a dramatic scene unfolded in the Belgian town of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, standing in the frigid air, watched as a German delegation approached. 4 Wehrmacht officers, their figures stark against the snowy, war-torn landscape, carried a white flag. This symbol heralded a historic message, an ultimatum brimming with self-assured confidence in an inevitable victory and a demand for surrender. The ultimatum read, "The fortune of war is changing." This time, the American forces stationed in and around Bastogne are tightly encircled by German armored divisions. The only way to avoid the complete annihilation of the encircled US forces is the honorable surrender of the town. The German officers, filled with unshakable certainty, awaited a response. They had reason for their confidence. Approximately 18,000 American soldiers were trapped, surrounded by superior enemy forces numbering around 30,000, supported by hundreds of tanks. Supply lines were severed, and severe weather precluded any air support. The nearest Allied reinforcements were over 100 miles away. However, the Germans were unaware that 130 miles to the south, General George S. Patton had just made a promise so audacious that even Eisenhower doubted its feasibility. This promise required moving an entire army in the most challenging winter conditions with unprecedented speed. The tide of the war was about to turn not through numerical superiority or technical equipment, but through the clash of German overconfidence with American determination and the boundless audacity of a general who refused to acknowledge the word impossible. The transformation, however, had already begun 6 days prior, in the pre-dawn gloom of December 16, 1944. At 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest shuddered under an explosion of power unseen on the Western Front since 1940. 1,500 German artillery pieces simultaneously unleashed their deadly fire across an 80-mile front, their shells whistling through the freezing air, targeting unsuspecting American positions. At the epicenter of this chaos was Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division, who later wrote in his diary a poignant entry. "The ground was heaving, trees were splintering, the very air seemed to shriek with terror. They told us the Germans were bled white. We were lied to." This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. In utmost secrecy, the Wehrmacht had concentrated a colossal army of 410,000 soldiers, 400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces. This monstrous force was covertly moved through the impassable Eifel forests under the cover of night, maintaining complete radio silence. Horses were used to deliver supplies to avoid the revealing noise of engines. On the eve of the decisive offensive, Major General Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, made a poignant entry reflecting the drama of the moment. He captured the image of soldiers frozen in silence, their breath turning into ephemeral clouds in the frosty air. The warriors understood the colossal importance of the upcoming operation, realizing that this was not just a routine attack, but their last chance to change the course of events. The German command's plan was aimed at identifying and exploiting the most vulnerable sector of the Allied defensive line. Here, in the rugged terrain, lay 4 American divisions whose ranks consisted of both inexperienced recruits and soldiers still recovering from wounds and the shocks of previous battles. Thanks to the element of surprise, the Germans managed to deliver a crushing blow to American units in the first hours, sending them into retreat. However, the success of the entire plan depended on one critically important condition: speed. The Wehrmacht needed to capture the strategically vital town of Bastogne, where 7 key roads converged within 48 hours. These transportation arteries were vital for the advance of German panzer divisions to their ultimate objective, the port of Antwerp, located 125 miles away. Without control of Bastogne, the entire offensive would inevitably bog down. Leading the 47th Panzer Corps, tasked with capturing the strategically important town of Bastogne, was General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz. Under his command were formidable forces: the battle-hardened 2nd Panzer Division, with 88 tanks and assault guns, the renowned Panzerlehr Division, with 57 tanks, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, consisting of 17,000 infantrymen. Meanwhile, from another direction, the 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles, was rapidly approaching Bastogne. Stationed in Reims, France, the paratroopers were recuperating after 72 days of fierce fighting in Holland when an urgent order arrived. There was no time for preparation, nor for winter clothing. Soldiers were told to grab their weapons and immediately load into trucks. December 17th, 9:00 p.m. The thermometer plunged to 10 degrees below 14 degrees as the first trucks carrying soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division moved through the night towards Bastogne. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment vividly recalled the journey. We passed endless columns of American troops retreating in panic. Many soldiers had no weapons, others no helmets. They yelled to us through the darkness, "Turn back, you'll all be killed there." One soldier, with a look of insane terror, grabbed my arm and whispered, "There are thousands of them. Tigers, panthers, they're all there." I pushed him away. We weren't turning back. The military convoy, stretching for miles, was an impressive sight. 380 trucks with a steady monotony carried the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division through the night. Tension hung in the air, as none of them knew for sure where they were being sent. Scarce maps and conflicting intelligence reports only added to the uncertainty. The only thing known for certain was that they had to beat the German forces and occupy Bastogne first, at all costs. The 101st Airborne Division comprised 85 officers and 11,035 enlisted men, totaling 11,140 personnel. The division included 4 infantry regiments, the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, as well as the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Support was provided by 4 artillery battalions and other service units. Advance elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment reached Bastogne at 11:30 p.m. on December 18th, just hours ahead of the main Wehrmacht forces. Task Force de Sobry, a unit from the 10th Armored Division commanded by Major William de Sobry, had already taken up defensive positions in Noville, located 3 miles north of Bastogne. At dawn on December 19th, the first engagement with advanced German units occurred. Sergeant William McCloskey, a tank commander from Task Force de Sobry, recalled, "The fog was so thick that visibility was no more than 50 yards. Suddenly we heard them approaching. The guttural rumble of German armor. When the first Panther tank emerged from the fog, it looked like a monster. Our 75mm shells bounced off its frontal armor like ping-pong balls. We had to let them get dangerously close to hit them in the side." The fierce battle for Noville raged throughout the day. The courageous Task Force de Sobry, with only 15 Sherman tanks, engaged in an uneven struggle against the full might of the enemy's 2nd Panzer Division. For 48 hours, the American tankers heroically held the line, destroying 31 German tanks before receiving orders to withdraw. Major de Saubry was severely wounded when an enemy shell struck his command post, but his selfless sacrifice bought precious time for the defense to be prepared. On December 20th, a new commander arrived in besieged Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, an experienced artillery officer known for his exceptional composure in the most critical situations, temporarily assumed command of the 101st Airborne Division while General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. McAuliffe would need all his coolness in the coming days as the situation around Bastogne continued to deteriorate. The operational map at McAuliffe's headquarters reflected a grim and alarming picture. German forces were relentlessly closing in on the town from 3 different directions. The enemy's 26th Volksgrenadier Division was infiltrating from the south and east, aiming to encircle Bastogne. The Panzer Lehr Division launched a powerful offensive from the east, posing a serious threat. Isolated elements of the 2nd Panzer Division threatened from the north, exerting additional pressure on the defenders. By noon on December 20th, the last road connecting Bastogne to the outside world, the Neufchâteau highway, had been cut, and the town found itself completely isolated. In the icy hell of the Ardennes, Captain Richard Winters, commander of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, ordered his soldiers to take up defensive positions. Dug in along the perimeter, the men listened to the ominous rumble of German tanks creeping through the night behind them. The ground was frozen solid, and entrenching tools snapped under the pressure of the permafrost. Soldiers, without regard for their hands, dug shelters, using helmets as makeshift shovels. Frostbite claimed limbs, and blackened, frozen feet became a common sight in these hellish conditions. Inside Bastogne itself, amidst the roar of cannon fire, some 3,000 civilians sought refuge in cellars as German artillery systematically leveled the town. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked tirelessly at an aid station located in the Runos Castle. She tended to the wounded, making no distinction between American and German soldiers. Tragically, she would not survive the siege. Bastogne's defense was held by approximately 18,000 men united by a common purpose. The corps was the 101st Airborne Division, numbering 11,140 troops. They were joined by Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, led by Colonel William Roberts, with about 40 operational tanks and 2,800 soldiers. Support was provided by the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with agile M18 Hellcats, as well as the 969th Artillery Battalion, composed of African-American soldiers and other artillery and support units. All were prepared to stand and fight to the death to defend Bastogne. The morning of December 21st was shrouded in an impenetrable gloom, with visibility no more than 100 yards. Dense fog, merging with snowfall, wove an impenetrable white veil that paralyzed all movement. According to U.S. Army meteorologists, the conditions were extremely unfavorable for any military maneuvers. For the German forces, such weather was a true salvation, like a gift from heaven. It grounded Allied fighter bombers, which had terrorized German columns since the Normandy landings. Oberleutnant von Lau, commanding units of the 2nd Panzer Division, rejoiced. The weather is on our side. Without air support, the Americans are just soldiers like us, and we have more tanks." However, the whims of the weather affected both sides of the conflict. German tanks struggled immensely to advance through the muddy slush caused by constant temperature fluctuations. Fuel consumption doubled as vehicles were forced to churn through the viscous mire. Trucks delivering much-needed supplies skidded on icy roads, turning them into traps. Wounded soldiers froze to death, unable to receive timely medical attention. Inside the besieged Bastogne perimeter, ammunition supplies reached a critical low. Artillery crews were forced to conserve strictly, limiting themselves to just 10 shells per gun per day. Medical resources were virtually depleted after the loss of a field hospital on December 19th. Painkillers had to be reserved exclusively for the most severe cases when suffering became unbearable. Food supplies dwindled, and soldiers were reduced to 1 meal a day. Private First Class James Sims of the heroic 101st Airborne Division recalled how they quenched their thirst with snow and how his comrade's feet froze to his boots in the foxhole. When a medic arrived to help, the soldier's toes came off with his boots, yet he didn't shed a tear, as if numb from the pain. Meanwhile, 125 miles south of Bastogne in Verdun, a completely different scene unfolded on December 19th. In a cold French barracks, where a single stove struggled to warm the air, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting of senior command staff. Figures such as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton were present. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, had just finished his report on the German breakthrough, and a heavy silence hung in the room. Eisenhower broke it, uttering words that would define the American response to the crisis. "We must consider the present situation as an opportunity and not as a disaster. There must be only cheerful faces at this table." The moment the word Bastogne was uttered, General Patton couldn't suppress a sarcastic smirk. He suggested letting the enemy advance all the way to Paris, then encircling and destroying them. However, Eisenhower, maintaining his seriousness, ordered an advance north and inquired how quickly Patton could move his troops to Bastogne. Patton's answer astonished all the officers present. He declared his readiness to launch an offensive with 3 divisions within 48 hours. Disbelief filled the room, and Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder expressed doubt about the possibility of moving an entire corps in winter conditions over icy roads for 100 miles in such a short time. Eisenhower, his face reddened, cautioned Patton against hasty actions, fearing he would send divisions piecemeal and they would be defeated. However, Patton was not boasting. Thanks to the foresight of his operations officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, who had previously warned the general about the concentration of German forces in the Ardennes, Patton had 3 operational plans ready for such a development. He had preemptively positioned depots of fuel, ammunition, and medical equipment along potential routes to the north. Patton calmly replied to Eisenhower that he had already issued preliminary orders, and his staff was developing 3 possible lines of attack. He only needed the commander's approval. He showed Eisenhower a map with the planned routes, explaining that Major General John Milliken's 3rd Corps, with the 4th Armored Division in the vanguard, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, would strike from the Arlon area and break through to Bastogne. The atmosphere in the room was tense. General Eisenhower meticulously studied the map, his brow furrowed. The distance to Bastogne seemed incredibly vast. The weather conditions were atrocious, and the roads had turned into a sheet of ice. However, the liberation of Bastogne was vital. Eisenhower addressed General Patton directly. "When can you start the operation?" Patton replied without hesitation, "The morning of December 22nd. "Go," Eisenhower cut in. Leaving the meeting, General Patton issued the order using a pre-arranged phrase, "Begin the game." This code signal launched one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers in military history. Within hours, a colossal armada of 133,000 vehicles moved north. The entire Third Army, numbering 250,000 soldiers, was to change direction. Huge stockpiles of food and ammunition, prepared for an offensive deep into Germany, were urgently redirected. Approximately 20,000 miles of telephone lines were relaid. Artillery crews, previously aimed east, hastily retargeted their guns in the opposite direction. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, received his orders at 7:00 p.m. on December 19th. His unit was to cover 150 miles across snow-covered terrain in just 19 hours. "We drove all night with our headlights off," Abrams recalled. Tank commanders, chilled to the bone, stood in their turrets, guiding drivers who could see almost nothing through the blizzard. Men fell asleep on the move and had to be shaken awake. The logistical challenges of the operation were truly colossal. Each Sherman tank consumed a hefty 175 gallons of fuel on its journey, and a division required at least 50,000 gallons just to reach its starting position. Countless fuel trucks continuously crisscrossed the roads, risking skidding into ditches due to the ice. If trucks broke down, fuel had to be manually transferred using 5-gallon jerry cans, a highly laborious process. Master Sergeant Frank Carousel of the 4th Armored Maintenance Company recalled working non-stop for 72 hours straight. "We were changing tracks on tanks while they were still moving into position. People's hands froze to the metal. There were times when skin tore off when they pulled their hands away, but no one stopped. We all understood that the paratroopers in Bastogne desperately needed our support." Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the situation had reached a critical point. The perimeter had shrunk to less than 16 miles. German artillery was systematically shelling every defensive position. Aid stations were overflowing with wounded, indicating heavy casualties. On December 22nd, at 11:30 a.m., a group of 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag, signaling a truce. They were met by soldiers from F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The German delegation included Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men from the 9001st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Major Wagner carried an ultimatum printed on 2 sheets, one in English, the other in German. Notably, the English version was typed on an English typewriter, but with German diacritical marks added by hand, indicating haste and possibly limited resources. When the fateful message reached the command post, it was immediately delivered to General McAuliffe, who was at that moment snatching a brief sleep in the basement of the Belgian barracks, serving as his headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke the general and informed him of the arrival of German parliamentaries demanding surrender. McAuliffe's reaction was instant and emphatic. "Nuts!" An excited staff surrounded the general as he read the German message aloud. It vividly described the desperate situation of American troops. warned of the German artillery's readiness to wipe them off the face of the earth, and asserted that only surrender could prevent complete annihilation. Colonel Moore inquired about the appropriate response. McAuliffe seemed genuinely puzzled. "I don't know what to say." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard suggested, "What you said at the very beginning, General, would be hard to beat." McAuliffe laughed. "You mean nuts?" The room erupted in cheers of approval. General McAuliffe, sitting at his desk, penned the legendary reply to the German command, "Nuts, the American commander." When Colonel Joseph Harper delivered the response to the German officers waiting at the gates of Bastogne, they were utterly bewildered. "Nuts? What does that mean?" they wondered. Harper, barely concealing his contempt, explained, "It means go to hell, period. And remember, if you dare attack again, we will destroy every German who tries to break into the city." Major Wagner, unable to tolerate the insolence, retorted, "We will kill many Americans. It is war." "Go ahead, buddy," Harper replied. "Good luck to you." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted his surprise at the very fact that an ultimatum had been sent. According to him, the Panzer Lehr Division had sent a parley team to Bastogne without his knowledge. The demand for surrender was rejected, which, however, was entirely in line with the general's expectations. The German reaction to McAuliffe's defiant response was immediate and particularly brutal. That same evening, the Luftwaffe launched its first massive raid on Bastogne. For the defenders hunkered down in their foxholes, it was a prelude to true hell. Corporal Walter Gordon of Company E recalled, "The ground shook as if in an earthquake. Trees burst into flames. Shrapnel ripped through the air like angry hornets. We hugged the frozen earth and prayed. Temperatures dropped to nearly 10 degrees. 12 degrees. In the perimeter foxholes, soldiers took turns standing watch to avoid freezing to death. They adapted by urinating into empty K-ration cans to avoid leaving their shelters. Being exposed for even a few minutes could mean death from sniper fire or frostbite. The problem of food supply became particularly acute. The official ration was 1 K-ration per day, providing approximately 2,800 calories, while soldiers operating in severe cold required around 4,000 calories. Soldiers quickly learned how to save the waxed cardboard K-ration boxes, which burned long enough to heat a canteen of snow and turn it into drinking water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey found an unexpected solution. Soldiers discovered that hundreds of dead German horses, frozen solid, presented a source of fresh meat. They hacked off pieces with bayonets and cooked them over fires made from ammunition crate debris. The meat tasted awful, but it helped them survive. December 24th brought both hope and horror to Bastogne. The weather began to improve, raising hopes for air resupply. However, this also allowed the Luftwaffe to launch its most devastating raid. At 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, German bombers appeared over Bastogne. One bomb struck an aid station where René Lahme was working. The building collapsed, burying dozens of wounded soldiers and medical personnel under the rubble. Corporal Kenneth Moore was outside when the bomb fell. He heard the explosion and rushed to the building, but only a pile of rubble remained where the aid station had been. Voices from below, cries for help, and calls for mothers were heartbreaking. Soldiers dug with their bare hands all night, recovering bodies. Miss Lahme died, remaining with the wounded who could not be evacuated. This bombing killed 30 American soldiers and a Belgian nurse who had become a symbol of hope for the wounded. Augusta Chaiwi, a Belgian nurse of Congolese descent, displayed incredible resilience, assisting the wounded for 30 hours straight after the devastating bombing. As Christmas Eve gave way to Christmas Day, General Patton's Third Army struggled through a blizzard. The German counter-offensive, which began on December 22nd, was clearly behind schedule. For example, the 4th Armored Division had advanced only 7 miles in 3 full days of fierce fighting. General Patton, known for his unconventional approach to military matters, made an unusual request to his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. On December 22nd, "Chaplain, I want you to compose and distribute a prayer for good weather. I'm fed up with our soldiers having to fight not only the Germans but also mud and floods. Let's see if you can get God on our side." O'Neill expressed skepticism about the success of such an endeavor. "Sir, such a prayer would require a prayer rug of impressive size." To which Patton replied, "I don't care if it's a magic carpet. I want you to compose a prayer for good weather, and I want it to be effective." Soon, the prayer was printed on 250,000 cards and distributed among the Third Army soldiers. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle." And a miracle occurred. On December 23rd, the weather suddenly changed. For the first time in a long while, the sun broke through the dense clouds. This break in the bad weather was a true blessing. After 7 days of continuous fog and snowfall, visibility unexpectedly improved to 10 miles. It remains to be seen whether this was the result of a divine intervention or a simple meteorological coincidence. Finally, after a long week of trials, the temperature rose above freezing for the first time. But, more importantly, this allowed Allied aircraft to take to the skies and provide much-needed support to the besieged troops. At 9:50 a.m., a reconnaissance plane appeared over long-suffering Bastogne, leaving a bright trail of colored smoke, marking safe zones for cargo drops. By 11:50 a.m., the sky was literally filled with C-47 transport planes, arrayed in a perfect formation of 241 aircraft. Sergeant Jack Agnew, a member of the Pathfinder team, recalled the moment with enthusiasm. "We popped purple smoke to clearly mark the drop zone, and then we heard them. First a quiet, barely discernible hum, which gradually grew into a powerful roar of engines. The sky overhead instantly darkened with the sheer number of planes. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen in my life." Cheers erupted in the trenches of Bastogne. Soldiers, unable to believe their luck, poured out of their shelters, waving their helmets and openly weeping with joy. For 7 long days they had been completely alone, cut off from the outside world. And now, at last, the heavens had opened, sending them long-awaited aid. At 11:55 a.m., the first parachutes unfurled in the air, and a veritable rain of supplies descended to the ground. Ammunition, medicine, food, warm blankets, and, most valuable of all, desperately needed artillery shells. Of the 1,146 bundles dropped, an impressive 95% were successfully collected and delivered to the city's defenders. Captain James Parker, G4 Logistics Officer of the renowned 101st Airborne Division, played a key role in coordinating the collection of these vital supplies. He witnessed the heroism of ordinary soldiers who, undeterred by enemy fire, rushed to retrieve these life-saving bundles. One private, wounded by shrapnel, displayed incredible willpower, continuing to drag his load to safety despite blood streaming down his face. However, German forces were not content to stand idly by and watch. Anti-aircraft guns positioned around Bastogne opened heavy fire on the C-47 transport planes, which, flying at a low altitude of 300 meters, presented an easy target. Nevertheless, by December 26th, Allied aircraft had delivered 120.7 tons of supplies to the besieged city by parachute and another 92.4 tons by glider. The culmination of these efforts was the air bridge on December 26th, when 289 flights were made to Bastogne. Early on Christmas morning at 2:45 a.m., German artillery unleashed its most powerful barrage of the entire defense on Bastogne. For 2 long hours, American positions were under continuous fire. Then, at 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark V tanks from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, accompanied by infantry in white camouflage suits, launched an offensive on the western perimeter of the defense. The attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mähler, who had received direct orders from General Kokot. "Bastogne must be taken today. This is the Führer's Christmas wish." In fierce fighting, German tanks managed to breach the first line of defense, bravely held by Company A of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Private First Class Kenneth Hendris held a position on the second line, feeling the ground shake under the assault of enemy machines. According to him, in the rays of the rising sun, the tanks looked like true monsters, and shots from American bazookas did not harm them, merely ricocheting helplessly off their armor. However, American command had anticipated such a scenario and skillfully positioned its tank destroyers. M18 Hellcat self-propelled guns from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were cleverly concealed in the ruins of destroyed buildings. As the German tanks passed, American crews opened fire from the flanks, delivering devastating blows to the enemy's most vulnerable points. Sergeant Bill Harper, commander of one of the Hellcats, recalled, "We let them get close, then hit them from the rear where the armor was thinner. My gunner, Corporal Johnson, showed incredible skill. Just 5 shots and 3 tanks were reduced to scrap metal." By 10 a.m., all 18 German tanks were destroyed, turned into burning wreckage. Approximately 400 German soldiers lay on the snow-covered battlefield. Subsequently, one captured German officer confessed during interrogation, "Your defense was beyond praise. After today's battle, we realized that taking Bastogne is beyond our capabilities." In the midst of the harsh winter of 1944, with the Christmas holidays overshadowed by bloody battles, General McAuliffe addressed his exhausted but unbroken troops. In his speech, he recalled the audacious demand for surrender from the German invaders and his legendary reply, which became a symbol of American resilience. The general proudly declared that they had managed to halt the enemy's crushing onslaught, which had been advancing from all directions. On December 26th at 4:00 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Burgess, commander of a Sherman tank named Cobra King from the 37th Tank Battalion, peered through his periscope at the smoke-shrouded Belgian village of Assenois. The long-awaited breakthrough to Bastogne, just 6.5 kilometers, 4 miles, away, seemed closer than ever. For 4 long days, the 4th Armored Division had fought its way through fierce German resistance, reclaiming every inch of ground at the cost of immense effort and bloodshed. The final assault began at 2:20 p.m., when Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams ordered his battalion to launch a decisive attack, requesting maximum artillery support. "I need every gun you have," he radioed. In response to his call, within minutes, a fiery barrage of 2,140 artillery shells rained down on German positions around Assenois. Lieutenant Bogus recalled how German soldiers frantically ran from their foxholes, trying to escape the deadly hail. When the roar of the artillery subsided, Abrams gave the long-awaited order, "Forward!" The tankers, like arrows released from a bow, charged at full speed, firing all their weapons. Private James Hendris, a machine gunner in Cobra King, described this breakthrough as a triumphant march. "We went through that town like a hot knife through butter. Germans were shooting at us from windows, from doors, from everywhere. Our 75mm gun tirelessly swung left and right. Point-blank shelling buildings turned into strongpoints." At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise, and before Bogus's eyes appeared American soldiers, engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion guarding the outer perimeter of Bastogne. "Come on, come in," they shouted, welcoming their liberators. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days. Overjoyed, Bogus radioed Abrams. Contact with friendly forces established. The siege of Bastogne was broken, but victory came at a great cost. The 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in this breakthrough. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered even heavier losses, 30 killed and 180 wounded. Nevertheless, the long-awaited corridor, though only 365 meters, 400 yards wide, was open, bringing hope to those besieged in Bastogne. News of the long-awaited breakthrough of the Bastogne blockade instantly spread through the city like wildfire. Encouraged soldiers who had previously conserved every round, now in a burst of jubilation, fired entire clips into the air, celebrating their liberation. Even the wounded in the aid stations, forgetting their pain, joined the general rejoicing. General McAuliffe, unflappable in his usual manner, simply greeted the arrivals briefly. "Glad to see you, boys." For the German army, however, the psychological effect of the Bastogne relief was devastating. Major General Kokot noted in his diary that the lifting of the city's siege was not only a tactical but also a moral defeat. According to him, Wehrmacht soldiers lost faith in the possibility of victory after witnessing the unwavering determination of American troops, which completely undermined their morale. Oberleutnant Kaufmann, serving in a panzer division, expressed himself even more frankly. He emphasized that the German command had thrown all available resources at taking Bastogne, elite troops, the last reserves of tanks and ammunition. But despite all efforts, the American paratroopers held out, and to the demand for surrender they gave a defiant refusal. The single word "nuts," according to the officer, inflicted more damage on German morale than massive bombardments. At the start of the siege, the Bastogne garrison numbered about 18,000 men. Between December 19th and January 6th, as of December 26th, the 101st Airborne Division lost 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing in action. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division lost about 500 soldiers. Meanwhile, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion managed to destroy 108 enemy armored vehicles, while losing only 17 of its own Hellcats. The collapse of the German war machine at Bastogne was marked by colossal losses. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division of the Wehrmacht lost over 60% of its personnel, indicating the catastrophic damage inflicted during the fierce fighting. The Panzer-Lehr Division, an elite unit, lost 42 tanks, severely weakening its offensive potential. The 2nd Panzer Division, after outflanking Bastogne, rushed towards the Meuse River but encountered an unforeseen problem, a severe shortage of fuel. Stopping just 6.5 kilometers, 0.4 miles, from the coveted waterway, it was completely destroyed by superior forces of the US 2nd Armored Division, a crushing blow to the German troops. December 27th brought improved weather conditions, allowing Allied air power to demonstrate its full might. Between December 23rd and 27th, Allied aircraft flew over 34,000 sorties, unleashing tons of deadly ordnance on the enemy. The Luftwaffe, which began the offensive with an impressive fleet of 2,000 aircraft, lost most of its combat effectiveness within a week, shrinking to fewer than 300 planes. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Clostermann, serving in the Royal Air Force and flying a Tempest fighter bomber, recalled the fierce battles over the battlefield. It was what we called tank strafing. The Germans had no air cover. We dove from 8,000 feet, fired our rockets at 2,000 feet and pulled up. Below, for many miles, German vehicles were burning. The most devastating raid occurred on December 26th when two 94 RAF Lancaster bombers unleashed their deadly cargo on German positions around St. Vith, dropping 140 tons of bombs. The powerful explosions turned every road within a 3-kilometer but 1.86-mile radius into an impassable quagmire. Non-commissioned officer Hans Barons of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, who miraculously survived this infernal raid, recalled, "The earth exploded, buildings disintegrated, people just disappeared, vaporized. When it was all over, I crawled out of my shelter and saw a moonscape." During the battle, General McAuliffe expressed special gratitude to the 19th Tactical Air Command, emphasizing that without their outstanding cooperation, holding the positions would have been impossible. A remarkable aspect of the entire siege of Bastogne was the psychological metamorphosis that occurred within the ranks of the German troops. Allied intelligence fully realized this phenomenon only after the end of hostilities. Initially, under the influence of propaganda, German soldiers went on the offensive convinced that Americans were weak and pampered warriors who would flee at the first serious confrontation. However, confronted with the reality in Bastogne, these illusions were shattered. Corporal Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, in a letter to his wife dated December 24th, later found on his body, wrote, "The Americans are not at all what they were made out to be. They fight like real devils." Yesterday I witnessed one American machine gun crew hold off an entire company for 3 hours. Major Jan Krag of the Panzer Lehr Division, captured on December 27th, stated during interrogation, "You won not because of numerical superiority or weaponry, but because of your fighting spirit. At Bastogne we realized that American soldiers are true warriors." While the heroic defense of Bastogne made headlines, the operation conceived by Patton to break the blockade was a true triumph of operational art, marking a turning point in warfare. The scale of this operation is astonishing. In just 72 hours, Patton's Third Army moved 250,000 soldiers over 100 miles, 160 kilometers on icebound roads. Simultaneously, 133,000 vehicles were redeployed without any serious traffic jams. Signal corps laid 20,000 meters, 600 feet of telephone cable. 70 new ammunition supply points were established. 40 fuel depots holding 1,192,705 liters, would spend 500,000 gallons of gasoline, were created. Medics set up 20 field hospitals. 4,000 tons of ammunition were delivered to the troops, and 62,000 maps were distributed. Colonel Oskar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, later remarked, "What Patton accomplished in those 3 days seemed an impossible task. By our calculations, planning such an operation should have taken at least 6 days. The key to this success lay in meticulous preparation. As it turned out, 2 weeks before the events described, Patton had been rehearsing this exact scenario, anticipating such a turn of events, while other generals dismissed the very possibility of a German offensive. Patton demonstrated foresight by ordering his staff to develop detailed contingency plans. The heroic efforts of the medics in besieged Bastogne exemplify selflessness and professionalism. Despite the fact that by December 19th, a large portion of medical resources and personnel had fallen into enemy hands, doctors and medics performed miracles of salvation, working at the limits of human endurance. Major René Bowman, chief surgeon of the 101st Airborne Division, performed 167 surgical procedures over 10 days, often without adequate pain relief. When generators failed, operations were conducted by candlelight, and when morphine ran out, cognac borrowed from Belgian homes was used as an anesthetic. Technical Sergeant Eugene Rowe of Easy Company, risking his life under artillery fire, assisted over 200 wounded carrying nothing but medical supplies. The triumphant defense of Bastogne and Patton's subsequent operation to relieve the town had strategic significance far beyond a tactical victory. Hitler's grandiose plan to defeat Allied forces and recapture Antwerp suffered a crushing fiasco. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces on the Western Front, admitted after the war that Bastogne became the grave of the Battle of the Bulge. According to him, German forces needed to capture this vital road junction by December 18th. But the resilience of the American defenders, who held out for a full week and awaited reinforcements, buried any hope for the success of the entire operation. In December 1944, the German High Command, desperately trying to turn the tide of the war, threw its last hopes, a strategic reserve of 25 divisions, into the Ardennes offensive. However, this gamble proved catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. Over a month and a half of fierce fighting, German forces suffered colossal losses, estimated at 81,000 to 98,000 men. Additionally, more than 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed, and the Luftwaffe lost 1,000 aircraft. These losses proved irreplaceable for Germany, sealing its eventual defeat. American forces also suffered significant casualties. Approximately 75,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, including 19,000 who died valiantly. Nevertheless, the United States possessed sufficient resources to compensate for these losses. By January 1945, fresh divisions were arriving from overseas at an impressive rate, 1 per week. But the most crucial consequence of the Ardennes offensive was the depletion of Germany's last reserves. When Soviet forces launched their winter offensive on January 12, 1945, the Wehrmacht had no strength left to transfer to the Eastern Front. The road to Berlin lay open. The Battle of Bastogne, a pivotal episode of the Ardennes campaign, gave rise to legends that live on to this day. American General McAuliffe's famous reply, "Nuts!" delivered to German emissaries, entered American military folklore as a symbol of unyielding defiance. Patton's swift tank march to relieve Bastogne became a classic example studied in military academies worldwide as a model of operational art. In December 1984, Bastogne once again welcomed veterans, both American and German, for the 40th anniversary of those dramatic events. former adversaries, once separated by the front lines, met as comrades, united by a shared past. General McAuliffe, a venerable 87-year-old veteran, delivered a poignant speech, emphasizing, "We fought here not for territorial conquest, but in the name of freedom and ideals. We were driven not by blind hatred, but by a sense of duty to our country and our comrades. And when the war ended, we made every effort to rebuild what had been destroyed in its flames." Hans Detmer, a former Hauptmann from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, who also attended the anniversary celebrations, shared his reflections. "In 1944, I stepped onto this land as a conqueror, driven by imperial ambitions. But today I return as a friend with a deep sense of remorse and respect. The Americans with whom we fought fierce battles taught us a valuable lesson about what true democracy is, not a sign of weakness, but an unyielding strength of spirit and will. Today, on the hill dominating Bastogne, stands the majestic Bastogne Memorial, a star-shaped monument dedicated to the memory of 76 killed, 190 American soldiers who gave their lives in the bloody Battle of the Bulge. Every year, on December 16th, precisely at 5:30 a.m., the exact hour the devastating German offensive began, the bells of Bastogne ring out across the town, mourning the fallen heroes. In the central square, the Sherman tank Barracuda from the 11th Armored Division proudly stands, a living symbol of liberation. Children joyfully play on it, climbing over the armor that once saved their grandparents from certain death. Vincent Speranza, a brave paratrooper who brought beer to wounded soldiers during the fighting, returned to Bastogne numerous times to honor his comrades. In gratitude, the town brewery created a special beer in his honor called Airborne. During his last visit in 2019, at the venerable age of 96, he raised his glass and declared, "To those boys who couldn't come home, to those who will never forget, to freedom." Concluding the operation in Bastogne, the impressive figures characterizing the scale and intensity of the fighting cannot be overlooked. The American contingent in Bastogne at the start of the operation numbered 18,000 soldiers, with 11,140 paratroopers from the renowned 101st Airborne Division forming its core. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division had only 40 battle-ready tanks at its disposal. Total American losses in this battle amounted to approximately 4,500 personnel. The German armada targeting Bastogne initially comprised 25,000 to 30,000 soldiers, but later swelled to 55,000. The Wehrmacht suffered significant losses in the vicinity of Bastogne, losing over 15,000 men and more than 100 tanks. Patton's task force, rushing to aid the besieged, was a formidable power. 250,000 soldiers were moved north using 133,000 vehicles. Under harsh winter conditions, the troops had to cover over 160 kilometers, approximately 100 miles, to break the encirclement in just 5 days. The operation to resupply the surrounded troops played an equally vital role. When 200 tons of supplies were delivered by air, requiring 961 sorties by C-47 transport aircraft. On December 23rd alone, 241 planes participated in the operation. Thanks to the coordinated efforts of logistical services, the recovery rate for drop supplies reached 95%. Weather conditions also played a part in the battle's progression. For 168 hours, temperatures remained below freezing, dropping to +12 grader per 10 degrees. From December 19th to 22nd, visibility did not exceed 90 meters, 300 feet, hindering combat operations. Only on December 23rd did the weather relent and the sun appeared in the sky. In January 1945, addressing Parliament, Winston Churchill emphasized that the battle was the greatest American battle of the war, one that would forever be remembered as an outstanding American victory. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery also noted the heroism of American soldiers in Bastogne, calling their valor one of the brightest pages in the military history, which would live on as long as people value courage. Perhaps the most poignant tribute came from former Wehrmacht General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, whose panzer divisions had encircled Bastogne. In 1954, visiting the memorial, he paid his respects to the fallen, stating, "They were worthy adversaries who became the best of friends." Their struggle was not for conquest, but for principles, and that is why they deserve their victory. The German forces, who initially mocked the Americans surrounded in Bastogne, learned a harsh lesson in those cold December days of 1944. They realized that free people fighting shoulder to shoulder possess greater strength than any army striving for territorial conquest. They understood that resolve and fortitude of spirit mean more than numerical superiority. They were convinced that democracy, when confronted with the mortal threat, can resist with a power that tyranny can never withstand. The defense of Bastogne became the clearest confirmation that freedom, when truly threatened, invariably finds its valiant defenders. In the harsh December of 1944, these heroes were the soldiers wearing the screaming eagle emblem of the 101st Airborne Division and the triangle symbolizing the Third Army under General Patton. They were young men who grew up on Iowa farms and in New York City tenements, on spacious Texas ranches and at California factory machines. They were the embodiment of America itself, its strength and spirit. On one of the quiet hills near Bastogne, a trench remains preserved, as if frozen in time, exactly as it was in that tragic December of 1944. Next to it stands a plaque with a concise inscription, words spoken by a young paratrooper whose name, unfortunately, is lost to history, but whose indomitable spirit continues to live in the hearts of descendants. They've got us surrounded. The poor bastards. This exemplifies the greatest defiance, a categorical refusal to acknowledge defeat, even when it seems imminent and inevitable. This was the very spirit of Bastogne, which became a shield against tyranny. It was this spirit that brought Patton's tanks, carving their way through snowdrifts. And when the decisive moment arrived, when freedom itself hung by a thread, they responded with one word that entered history forever: nuts. The mocking taunts of the German soldiers were silenced in the snows around Bastogne, buried beneath the roar of Patton's approaching tanks and the unbreakable spirit of the encircled paratroopers who simply refused to surrender. Mockery gave way first to respect, then to admiration, and ultimately to friendship. The fortress of democracy stood firm. The arsenal of freedom achieved a convincing victory, and in this triumph, a bright future for the entire free world was secured.